Um, Welcome. I have no slides to keep you awake for the afternoon session. So I'm just going to speak about some things I feel passionate about and some ideas that I've worked with a long time, over the past 40 years, which is a surprise to me as well that I'm still here after 40 years, but here I am. Firstly, I thought I'd clarify a few things because in the last few days we've been talking about a lot of issues. And the first thing really is this term culture, which comes up time and time again. In my experience, people have a very different understanding of culture that maybe we have, and I'm not even sure we have a good understanding of it when we talk about it. For a lot of people, it's a negative. For a lot of people, culture they equate with art, and for a lot of people, art is really not something that they engage with. They would see it as elitist. They would see it as not part of their daily lives. And I think that's a problem to start with when we speak of culture and when we're trying to engage with people. I think there's many reasons for this, not least the way that art is represented by the dominant class in society and our own experience in school or whatever way we've come into contact with art. And I'd also, as an example of this, just like to draw your attention to how maybe art institutions are represented. If you look at institutions, government institutions, financial institutions like banks, and art institutions, be they galleries or national museums, they all have the same facade, which is the Greek Doric column facade. And the reason is that they all are pillars of society. They all represent the status quo. And I think that's a good example of how most people see art. The result of this understanding for most people is that they feel disempowered by art and culture. And they're not involved in any way. They don't feel engaged with it. And certainly it's not their culture or what they value. And even worse, I think it makes their culture worth less than what might be the dominant culture. And it certainly applies to the poor people, marginalized people, disadvantaged people in society. This is certainly what I felt growing up because I'm from a working class community in Dublin. And the only career advice I ever got in school, by the way, was that I shouldn't put my address on any applications I made. And I think my attitude to art and culture at the time was informed by that. But as a result of my background, I think I had a passion to actually explore all these issues. And for some reason, and maybe it was because of the 1960s that I was involved with, art became very important through music and through other art forms and through this idea of counterculturalism. I think, getting back to this definition of culture, I clarified it for myself some years ago. And this came out of a study that Trinity College in Dublin had done, and they studied all the cities in Europe, a lot of major cities in Europe, and they looked at young people's behavior. They looked at things like alcohol abuse, drug abuse, antisocial behavior, suicide. And they wanted to see in which cities were these activities most prevalent and how could they be dealt with. Now, a big surprise to the Dublin community was that Dublin teenagers came out near bottom of the list, that they had big difficulties and they were in lots of trouble, whereas Amsterdam came out on top. And this was a big surprise for a Catholic country who thought we had the answers and we were bringing up kids in the proper way. But of course, anybody who knows Amsterdam knows that the Dutch are, very upright and upstanding, and it's really the tourists who take advantage of the Dutch liberal laws and attitude. But the most interesting thing about this study was that the reason they came up with, the main reason why kids, say in Dublin, were in difficulty was because they could see no future. They didn't have a stake in the future in any way. Whereas the kids in Amsterdam felt very much that they had a stake in the future. And I think if you feel you have no stake in your future, then lots of things go wrong and lots of possibilities are shut down. And this applies to cities and everything, communities, everything we do. So from that, I came up with my very simple definition of culture, which is culture is about having a future. And that's my definition. And I think that applies, if you apply that to everything, it makes culture understandable. It makes culture real in every situation. I guess this brings me on to another point, and that's, how do you implement this? What does this mean in reality? And this goes back to a lot of the things we've been talking about over the last few days. How do you realize that future? Well, the first thing is to understand that the future is a blank canvas. It is not created. It is totally open what you do. And it is a creative act. It's a work on your own level, on your personal level, your community level, your city level. And the next minute, the next hour, the next week, the next year is totally open. You can do anything you like with those. You can create whatever you want in the next minute. It's your choice. And I think this possibility has been taken away from a lot of people, this idea that you can actually create your own future. And there's good reasons for that, in that it also creates a very powerful possibility to change. And the one thing we know is that people in power and people who hold the power and the money are not interested in change. They don't want change. But if you actually realize this possibility, you become very powerful. It's empowering to do this. And I think our whole society, from school to work, from leisure, everything that we do is focused on disempowering us from this message. And we're told that our creativity is not important, that our creativity is pretty valueless. But we can buy this over the counter. This is where consumerism comes in. For whatever we pay, 10 euros, 5 euros, we buy the ideas. This is what the indoctrination is in consumerism, that we actually are creating our future by buying things, whereas we have the possibility to change things through our own creativity. And that would also be my definition of art. Art, for me, is creation. It's creativity in every form. And it's not necessarily creativity in products or symbols or what comes out of it. It's actually the process of creativity that's the most important thing. I think, and this in a way brings me on to the next point, which is about the cultural industries or the creative industries or the creative economy that we've been talking about a lot the last few days. And I have a problem with this. I've never been very comfortable with these terms. And I think this stems from the fact that it all began with Margaret Thatcher. And I'm sorry for bringing this up after lunch. I know you're trying to digest your meals, and it's slightly sickening, but I have to mention her. And I'll explain this, a bit of history. Yesterday, Charles spoke of the moment when this concept of the creative economy came into force, when it was realized in the UK that music was a greater export than cars, than the motor industry. But I would start with a policy change, I think, rather than the economic change. And it took place in the 1980s. And in 1984, Margaret Thatcher's Minister for the Arts then, Lord Gowrie, oversaw the publication of an Arts Council document called The Glory of the Garden. And The Glory of the Garden, which on the surface aimed to redistribute resources towards the regions, and called for a bigger drive for box office income, more patronage, more business sponsorship for the arts, was really a manifesto at the time for the Tory party and their approach to arts and culture. And their view was that only excellence that represented Great Britain should be supported, and that it should be a world leader. It should be represented in that way. And then second of all, that the welfare state system of arts funding should be dismantled in favor of a more private sponsorship or private income model. This model was later redefined or defined by Tony Blair into the creative industries. It continued on as that. To implement this manifesto, it was very interesting how she did it, and it was very clever, because since the 1960s, a lot of arts centres, arts organisations, arts labs had grown up around Britain, and many, by 1984, were now community art centres, very much so. And they were multidisciplined, intercultural, multi-space places by nature. Because in these spaces, the process, as I said, this is attached to community arts, was more important or as important as the product, the process of creativity and finding your cultural voice. And also being engaged with a wider social agenda. And by wider social agenda, I mean recognition for all the population that they had a voice in culture. And by having a voice in culture, I don't mean going to galleries and museums and being an audience or being a passive audience. I mean actually having the means and the capacity to create and to express yourself creatively. And that different voices in the society could be heard and could have equal value. And that it wasn't just a predominant class who were cultural or cultured. And where, you know, the predominant class were the most funded, as in the so-called heritage arts, opera, ballet, all of these things, national theatre. And what Thatcher did very cleverly was, her policy was that you had to be a centre of excellence to get funded. So before, what you had was you had spaces that were multifunctional and that were based on the process. So the product wasn't that important, it was the process that was important. Now you had to have a space, a place of excellence that was going to produce something that was excellent. And this basically meant that you had to exclude a lot of people and you had to exclude a lot of disciplines and you had to concentrate on maybe one discipline, be it dance or whatever. And this usually also meant bringing in specialists rather than activists. So local or grassroots activists were replaced by specialists in these art forms. So many places closed because of this, many places changed at that time. And the radicalism that had existed in these places from the 60s was drained away, and the citizens basically lost a lot of possibilities for development through arts and culture. The other side of Thatcher's policy was the economic side and the beginning of this idea of cultural industries. And that focused more on the economic outcomes rather than the cultural or artistic outcomes. And that creativity in society really changed from a more social activity or a communal activity to a specialist activity. And it was also, of course, parallel to all her other changes about dismantling the welfare state, etc., etc. This, of course, is a backdrop to this whole struggle that has gone on for 200 years, basically, since the the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And it's happened in cities mainly because cities grew hugely from the time of the Industrial Revolution. That was the beginning of the mega city. And really it's a struggle between the neoliberal agenda and grassroots movements. And you see this more and more these days because of the recession, because it's laid bare. And the struggle is very acute in some places. But this struggle is not new. This struggle for voice, this struggle for participation is not new in society and in cities. It goes back over 200 years. And it has had the same agenda, although the context may change and the actual particulars might change. It is the same struggle. I guess I said earlier about the stakeholders and people having a voice, but it happens time and time again that grassroots initiatives are written out of any future planning for a neighbourhood or a city. If there are consultations or invited participation, it is usually more of a PR exercise or a marketing exercise. And if you have people who are passionately involved and committing their time and energy to making their communities and cities a better place, why are they rarely supported, or more often, they're actually crushed? Here we are talking about what the powerful vested interests see as challenges to their power. It's about ownership and it's about the hierarchy of culture. I believe passionately that the place to start with the development of a city is the citizen. And you have to build on local histories, communities, NGOs, the grassroots initiatives. This is where city development should start. It should be nurturing and careful and supportive. The grand gestures like iconic buildings or the Guggenheims are not really the answer. The local character and uniqueness of a place and the people should be the starting point, and cultural equality should be the methodology. Everyone has the right to be valued, to have their stake in the city valued, and to have a voice in the future of a city or a community. And this brings me on to the important question of values. What are the values that underpin any decisions that are made? And I think this is very interesting. You always have to look at where the decisions are made and what the decisions mean and what the values are underpinning those. The question was asked yesterday by Tom, who benefits from the creative industries? And to answer this, I think you have to identify who the stakeholders are and where, if anywhere, do the citizens fit into the picture. I can tell you now that if you're poor or marginalized or disadvantaged, you will not fit into the picture. If your values are centered around making as much money as possible, then citizens will come very low down on your list of priorities. This leads me on to how cities are developed and who is involved in the decision making. Who are the mediators and the leaders? What are the relationships and processes around how neighborhoods and communities are built? And in my experience, communities are not valued in this process. I think cities are not playgrounds for engineers or city planners or tourists or business people. Cities are where people live, and the only way to develop a city is to start with the citizens. Yesterday, a question was asked at Charles' session about the possibility of some citizens reacting negatively to the creative city. In fact, this happens all the time. Of course, if you are not a partner in the process as a citizen, and others outside of your community are benefiting from the development of your neighborhood, you will resist. For instance, in San Francisco, there's a growing problem and backlash from citizens who live in the center city. The reason is that many of the young techies who live in Silicon Valley want to live in the city. So they are buying up property at highly inflated prices and turning neighborhoods into their creative playgrounds. Their bosses are complicit in this because they want their whiz kids to be happy. So they are laying on regular buses that ferry this community from the city centre to the valley. An example of this is multi-billionaire Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, who has submitted a raft of planning applications in the Dolores Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. The flood of these new rich into the city and their private bus routes to the valley is controversial with many San Francisco residents, and rallies and protest marches have begun to take place as they see rents rising and the cost of living going up all around them, and because they also see the rise of bedroom communities, where neighborhoods are dead for most of the day. This might seem benign enough, this issue, but the same is happening in many cities for similar reasons. In Berlin, for instance, there is a growing campaign against hipsters, what are called hipsters. There have been protests, and if you go into the former East German area of Kreuzberg or in New Cologne, you will find graffiti targeted at gentrification. Gentrification led by creative people, artists, designers, people moving in. And what the residents know is that hipsters, as they call them, is a signal that developers and tourists are not far behind and the rents and prices start rising. Then communities begin to fall apart, especially if they are poor and have no resources or power. The posters are reading "Kites Killer," which literally means neighborhood killer. And there are similar movements in London's Dalston area and Williamsburg neighborhood of New York. The High Line in New York was mentioned yesterday, and while it is a great project, no one was keeping an eye on the fact that the property prices around the park have risen tenfold since it opened. This has been a trend for the last 20 years or so, as poorer communities of inner cities have been simply uprooted and displaced to make way for property development, usually funded through the private-public partnership. This model has made a small group of people very rich and destroyed whole neighborhoods, leaving ugly, dysfunctional, and bleak commercial developments in their wake. The other P missing from the PPP model is people that should be an equal partner in these developments. And then there's tourism that's been talked about a few times. And culture is at the heart of tourism. When first conceived, cities grew from the inside out, like towns and villages. People settled and they began to build their homes, their schools, they began to build shops, leisure facilities. And all towns had their squares, which you can see in the old towns and old cities, where people and citizens gathered to talk and do business, to meet and to socialize. But as the idea of suburbs began to grow in the 1950s, town centers began to die, and the center of cities became commercial opportunities. And we see this now in every city. And it's the same here, I think, in Košice. With the advent of mass tourism, particularly because of cheap flights from, say, Ryanair and EasyJet, the center of European cities have become party destinations. My own city of Dublin is a good example of this in an area known as Temple Bar. Some of you might have been there. I used to live in Temple Bar back in the 80s. And at that time, it was an old part of the centre of Dublin. It was kind of sleepy, it had a community, and it was quite a nice place to live in. Without going into a long story, the bus company, the national bus company, decided they were going to put a bus station in the centre, which was a terrible idea, and they began to buy up property around the area. But they didn't have the money or the permission to do it, so they began to let the property back out on short-term leases and low rents. And as a result, artists and young people began to move in for studios, band rehearsal rooms, etc. And there was an organic development, a small but interesting development in the area. And it was compatible with the neighbors and with the businesses like small pubs and shops. But what happened then was that the government got an idea that they would apply to Europe for money to actually develop the area, and they called it Dublin's Cultural Quarter, using the idea that there was artists and people in there, creative people. And they got the grant. They got a large amount of money to develop this area. And then what happened was that as they began to develop it, the young people who had originally been there, of course, had to move out because they didn't have the money for the high rents that were being asked. And the people who did were the pubs, the bars, the hotels, and the cafes. And very quickly, with the cheap flights coming in from England, Ryanair particularly, it became a destination for stag parties, hen parties, and drinking weekends. So that became the predominant culture, which is still there. So if you want a good party destination, you can fly to Dublin and spend the whole weekend there, out of your mind, from Friday to Monday. And it's like Armageddon on a Saturday or Sunday night. And Dublin people don't really go in there anymore. It's unbelievable. I bring people in just to see it because they can't believe what they see sometimes. But there are cultural organizations still in there, but that's the predominant activity there. You also see this in lots of other cities. I know Barcelona very well, and the Ramblas has become the same. By the way, just as an aside, many years ago I was in Ghent in Belgium, and it was the start of all of this development, private-public partnerships. And in Ghent there was an area that was occupied by prostitutes, and they decided that they'd develop the area, get rid of the prostitutes and the seedy nature of that area, and develop this shopping mall, which was an old market. And they developed it, and they opened it up. And the only people who could afford the rents were the prostitutes. So instead of them in on the street, they had these great windows, and they had very comfortable accommodation. So that's maybe a good result, where the community comes back. The community in Temple Bar, like myself, we moved out very quickly because the area, we couldn't live in it anymore. It was too noisy, it was too dirty, there was a lot of crime, and we who were paying low rents originally were forced out. So that's a good example of what happens and what is happening all around Europe. And this, I think, brings me on to sustainable tourism. And the most important thing, I think, around city development is sustainability and how you will build it sustainably. And sustainable tourism, for instance, is a much slower and much more considered way of developing tourism, where you look at the environment, you look at the impact, you look at how you get the local citizens involved, and you develop what's there. At the moment, there's very little regulation, and there's a scramble between cities in competition for this tourism, which I think can be very detrimental. And for instance, here in Košice, I kind of dread the day when the cheap flights start ferrying in all these people. I think your city centre is going to change dramatically if you see that. Okay, I think if initiatives like this drive out the local community, then that part of the city is no longer living. I would consider it dead. And this leads on to more serious issues surrounding how cities are developed and who benefits. The citizens don't have any real say in these developments, certainly not an equal one. And a very clear example of this was the recent Gezi Park problem in Turkey, in Istanbul, which you're probably all aware of, and which sparked an uprising and some dreadful bloodshed across the country. But this was sparked by the plan to put a shopping centre and museum on top of a park. And I think that the officials and the business people who developed that project, that private-public partnership, is an extreme example of how citizens are crushed in those sort of confrontations. Sustainability, I've mentioned. Nature doesn't do things fast, and I think everything is part of a developmental process. And I think we have to be very careful and considerate when we actually take any development into account. And I want to say once again that, you know, the involvement of citizens for me is the most important thing. You build from the ground up. And all these issues like interculturalism, sustainability, etc., become less of an issue if the citizen stakeholders are part of the process. Cities must be livable, they must be diverse, they must be carefully built for people to live there. And you have to look for culture in unusual places. This idea that there is good culture and bad culture, or there's no culture in places, is wrong. Every community and every group has culture. It may be different than yours, or it may be different than the status quo, but it's there, and you can see the evidence of that everywhere, be it graffiti or be it symbols. Culture is, every group has its culture, and it should be valued, and that's where you should start, by respecting and valuing that culture. Supporting citizens' initiatives is really important. Projects that already exist. I'm always amazed that there's so much energy in communities and there's so much happening, but when it comes to development, they're very often excluded. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of fighting to actually get these initiatives supported, whereas there seems to be no end of money for major buildings or big iconic structures. But even a fraction of that money invested in people would have a huge benefit. And I guess it's because, going back to this idea of envisioning the future and having the change, that the powers that be are very afraid of this change and of giving people even a little bit of this creative power. Whereas it would be a huge advantage in a city to actually see how much could be achieved by investing in the people who are making things happen on the ground, the grassroots movement, the creative initiatives. For instance, here in Košice, I've been here now working for nearly a year. I've calculated 2 months here in total this year, which is quite a lot of time. There is a lot happening on the ground. There's incredible projects, there's amazing people, and they're not getting supported. And if they're not supported, people get burnt out, or they die, or they fail. And I think that's such a huge loss of human resources and human initiative and human creativity. And if you don't start with those, then what are you trying to do? You're trying to build something that is empty and fill it. You're trying to build something that actually doesn't have that passion and that energy and that interest. That you should be following the energy and the interest and investing in that. And this happens in every place. It's not only here. I've seen it time and time again. Nobody goes out and says to people, what do you need? What do you want? What do you need to actually develop? I never hear anybody saying that. I never hear anybody saying, okay, we will support you with what you need here. And it's usually modest, what people need. They're working for nothing, a lot of the people. They're voluntary or part-time. They have many projects on the go. They're passionate. And if they're not supported after a period of time, of course, they stop or they fall apart. And the other thing to say is that I travel a lot in Europe. I do work a lot around Europe now. And the most interesting things are happening at the periphery. They're not happening at the center. Now, the people at the periphery don't realize this because, of course, they always think the center is where it's all happening, be it London or Paris or somewhere. The really interesting ideas are happening at the periphery. And that's, in a way, where support should be going, and where, if you look at these, getting the new ideas for change, we're back to change again, but I think change is the most difficult thing, looks to be the most difficult thing to actually implement. I would argue that as well, that facilitation and mediation is what's needed, not consultation. You just need to empower people. You need to give people the capacity, the skills, and the possibility to do their work. And they are much more capable and able to do that than anybody from the outside because they're embedded in the community. So I would argue for facilitation and capacity building rather than consultation or something that's imposed from the outside. I think people have to realize their dreams, and they have to, that's the most important thing. If people don't have dreams in the future, then a society begins to die and begins to atrophy. Last year, when I was in Barcelona, you may have heard of this big movement, the Indignados, who were occupying Plaza Catalunya, which is the main square in Barcelona. And it was quite an amazing event because what you had was thousands of people, a lot of young people, but also older people, who occupied the square. And in a short space of time, they had literally built a community. They had a small clinic for people who were ill. They had coffee stands, food stands, workshops. They had music venue. They had lots of things going on. And it was there for quite a while. Then the police went in one day very brutally and drove them out very violently. And the news spread around the city very fast, and everybody went down, including us, to Plaza Catalunya. And within 2 hours, there was 100,000 people there. And people were asked to bring something to bang. So you brought pots or you brought pans, and 100,000 people banging things is a lot of noise, and you could hear it all over the city. But I loved their slogan, which was, "If you won't let us dream, we won't let you sleep." And I thought that was brilliant. And I think in these situations, coming back to the glory of the garden and this idea that originated to some degree with Thatcher, that phrase comes from a poem by Rudyard Kipling, who himself was an arch conservative, if anybody knows his background. And where she got this was his poem, and lines of his poem read like this. "And there you'll see the gardeners, the men and prentice boys, told off to do as they are bid, and do it without noise. O Adam was a gardener, and God, who made him, sees that half a proper gardener's work is done upon his knees." I would say, we have to very quickly move away from that, get up off our knees, and make a lot of noise. Thank you.
Okay, anyone like to comment or give a question to Sandy about anything that he spoke about? Yes, have we got another microphone?
Hello, thank you for a nice speech. I would like just to ask, as you started to speak about sustainable tourism, if you can imagine the new forms of creating new connections, what would you call a cultural way?
For tourism?
For example, or in a culture?
In culture. Well, I think, as I said, for me, you have to start with processes. You have to start with engaging people in creative processes. So, for instance, I think this whole urban garden movement is really interesting. In my own neighbourhood in Dublin, we have a very small urban garden. It's really small. But out of that has come 2 festivals a year, 2 street festivals, a organic soap making business, a composting business for the neighborhood. Out of that one little garden, which is really tiny, I mean, you hardly fit 6 people in it. And it's become a center for the whole neighborhood. There's also been music events. There's been lots of things happened. So I think what you need is local hubs like that, things that will spark, and they don't have to be very grand and ambitious. I think if they're organic, they can have a huge impact on a neighborhood or a locality or a community. Is that what you mean? Sort of.
Okay, anyone else?
You mentioned that for you, culture is having a future, but in many contexts, culture is about conserving the status quo to have a future for preserving the future. So this is particularly for many politicians, they don't want. So for them, the culture is and the future is the status quo. So the point is, how can the idea of capacity building and engaging, how can that can be done practically, considering that could be two kind of culture clashing each other. One that is looking to the future in a status quo, and one that is a process of creating. So how do you see this this clashing dimension, and how this dilemma can be overcome? Because usually politicians in many contexts, they don't want to engage the people that are already the potential catalyst for development.
It's true. I mean, that's what I said. That's probably the biggest problem, in that there isn't this engagement. But from my point of view, it's the capacity building that's the most important thing. I mean, I'm even drawing on my own background now. So for me, the politicians or the people who are involved were not important. They're not important in this process. The only importance is that, of course, they hold power and they have some money and capacity. But I think we really have to get over that. We have to go around that and get rid of that, because if you engage with politicians or you engage in any major way with a bureaucracy, it will win. It will grind you down for sure. So in my own life, you know, I decided I'm not going to engage with that. And even in our cultural centre in Dublin, we decided we're not going to engage with that. What we're going to do is draw our strength from people and draw our strength from our community. And politicians then follow. I don't know if there's any politicians here, but politicians and officials usually follow where the energy goes. And usually the center has so few ideas and so little things happening that they will follow where the energy is. So if you create the right energy, then you will find the support. But I wouldn't start with the politicians, because they will suck all the life out of any project that you have. Any politicians here want to counteract that?
No. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sandy. Thank you.